Swinburne University of Technology.
But my name's Matthew Mitchell, and I'll give you an introduction to this event and to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the main topic. But before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge that this meeting is taking place on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we ask that while you're on Wurundjeri land, that you treat it with the respect and behave in a manner consistent with the customs of the people in the land. So, thank you for that. So there's two panels of 4 presenters tonight. There's myself giving an introduction and an overview, and I'll be followed by Professor Jock Given, who'll be talking about cultural goods and services. Then Angela Davey, who'll be talking about copyright-related issues. And William Davis, who'll be talking about e-commerce and IP. There may be some overlap between all these issues. That's the nature of this pact. Each speaker has 15 minutes, inclusive of questions. So if the speaker stops at 10 minutes, there should be 5 minutes left for questions. And I'll come around and I may have to repeat the question for the recording. So if you ask me when I come around, I'll say it again to the presenter. The second panel is Health, Environment and the Community, and that has Nick Rose, who's the National Coordinator for the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance, and he'll be talking about agricultural and food policy. There'll be Deborah Gleeson from La Trobe University talking about public health, Bob Phelps from Gene Ethics talking about biotechnology, and Francis Morrill from MAG talking about health and genetic modification. The event has been sponsored by the Swinburne Institute for Social Research and the Faculty of Information and Communication Technologies. So what is the TPP? The official description, taken from the US trade site, is an ambitious 21st century Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that will enhance trade and investment among the TPP partner countries, promote innovation, economic growth and development, and support the creation and retention of jobs. So it all sounds very positive from that statement. It does have a relationship to other agreements and laws. There's the World Trade Organization, and there's a statement there where the World Trade Organization members recognise that since the Doha round, the world trade negotiations have been at an impasse and that new approaches are needed to get credible results. And one of the new approaches, people believe, is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's a North American Free Trade Agreement, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership may replace this in all or in part for Canada and Mexico. There are 2 US-based IP and copyright law proposals which may have an influence within the TPP, the Stop Online Piracy and the Protect IP Act that have been proposed in the United States. And there's another agreement, the ACTA Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, which affects internet users via IP and copyright. That was also negotiated in secret, but hasn't yet been ratified. It's been agreed to, but not ratified by all the partners. Now, the World Trade Organization, which is the precursor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and also a similar agreement being put together for the Atlantic called TTIP, is primarily focused on agriculture, industrial goods market access, services, trade facilitation, supporting development. It did have an aspect of trade-related intellectual property rights called TRIPS, and it also does have a disputes mechanism for enforcement of the agreement. And there's also a body within the World Bank, the International Centre for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, which also facilitates disputes. Now, the World Trade Organization negotiations weren't done in secret. They were an all-or-nothing agreement, and agreement wasn't reached. And that's what's been called the failure of the Doha round, and is a likely reason for the creation of the TTIP and the TPP pacts as a way to get agreement on some of those things that couldn't be agreed in the World Trade Organization forum. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership builds on and extends the World Trade Organization agenda items, but are specific to the Pacific region. It's been conducted in secret with 19 rounds of negotiation completed since March 2010, and it's due to conclude later this year. There were 2 chapters that were leaked. They include the intellectual property chapter and the investment chapter. And those 2 chapters caused a number of concerns among sort of civil society representatives. The areas that are suspected to be affected by the TPP once it's signed are domestic and international legal standards, and we'll talk a bit about that, environmental and financial deregulation, food safety and self-sufficiency, in particular in relation to mandatory labelling, government procurement, internet freedom, labour relations, patent protection, copyrights and public access to essential services. Now the original members are Australia, Brunei, Chile, Malaysia, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, Vietnam and the United States. Canada, Japan and Mexico have since joined, and it may also eventually include South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Laos, Colombia, Costa Rica, Indonesia, Bangladesh, India and China. So it may eventually include all those nations around that, or pretty much all the nations around that Pacific Rim. Now, one of the most contentious parts of the TPP is the disputes settlement. There's an investor-state dispute mechanism. This was proposed in the leaked investment chapter, which may allow investors the ability to sue governments. There's precedence for this. Ecuador introduced some environmental and safety laws which affected a mining company and was subsequently sued under a trade agreement. And there's the current case of Philip Morris seeking to sue the Australian government under a trade agreement, even though the federal court has ruled against them. So there's been an open letter published which has been signed by judges, judges, politicians, legal practitioners and academics, both from Australia and around the world, which calls for a rejection of any trade agreement that has an investor-state dispute settlement system. There was an earlier open letter put together by 30 community organisations and published by the Australian Fair Trade Investment Network, which also protested against the investor-state dispute mechanisms and other aspects of the TPP discussions. Now, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has its official position, and the key phrases or parts of this are underlined. We can boost Australia's trade by delivering new market access for Australian producers, including small and medium-sized enterprises. This next bit's a bit strange. We can provide frameworks for TPP parties to consider implications of changes in the business environment and emerging trade issues. I'm not quite sure what that means. The next bit makes more sense. To engage with countries which we do not have existing free trade agreements, like Canada, Japan, Mexico and Peru. Now, the DFAT statement does not identify the source of its claims for this boost of productivity, but they're presumably based on reports from the Productivity Commission. But the 2010 Productivity Commission report on bilateral and regional trade agreement states that there are concerns that the modelling used may overstate the benefits. And that the assumptions, well, there are questions about those assumptions, and they may be downplayed in public statements by those promoting these agreements. And the Commission's assessment was that it may lead to, will lead to unrealistic expectations about what will be obtained. So this is a very concerning statement in that report, and it's an interesting report. If you ever have the time to look at it, it might be worthwhile. But they're saying all this may skew consideration of the merits of proceeding with negotiations. The official Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade explanation for the secrecy is that the countries have agreed to keep the negotiation documents confidential, but there are regular public briefings, which Bill and I have been attending, at least some of them, and that this is normal practice in international negotiations. But it wasn't the practice for the World Trade Organisation negotiations. In the case of the TPP, DFAT say, this confidentiality safeguards our negotiating positions and strategies which cover sensitive national interests in relation to market access and Australia's trade and commerce more broadly. That's the official position. But the Productivity Commission report on trade, the same one I was talking about before, recognises that Australia's own Rural Industry Research and Development Corporation, which is a government organisation, has identified the following as a feature of a good trade model. Transparency, I'm quote, "Transparency is important at all stages to ensure that political motivations do not hijack PTA negotiations." The Commission's report later raises the following concerns in relation to trade agreements and does mention the TPP, that there may be inadequate public assessment of all the available options, that the agreements are not subject to meaningful, transparent assessment before they are signed, a lack of transparency, and an inadequate role for Parliament in the process. So as I say, there's some quite strong misgivings within that document. Now, the official DFAT statement on the ratification process is that it will go through the same democratic processes as other treaties that the Australian Government considers. Once the parties agree on the final text, the Government will make the agreement available publicly and open to scrutiny before the Parliament considers passing it into law. After ministers table the final TPP text in Parliament, the Parliament's Joint Standing Committee will coordinate a public review of the agreement. The committee can then invite submissions and evidence at public hearings to help determine whether it should recommend to Parliament that the TPP be ratified. So that was the official DFAT position on the ratification process. But the process, as identified by the Productivity Commission 2010 Trade Report, is not quite so clear. It indicates that an agreement is signed before it is tabled in Parliament, and it notes that the power to enter into treaties is an executive power within Section 61 of the Australian Constitution, and accordingly is a formal responsibility of the executive, I think that means Cabinet, rather than the Parliament. Yep. However, the power to implement treaties is a legislative power conferred upon the Parliament by Section 51 of the Constitution. That is, the Parliament is required then to pass the laws that have been agreed to in the agreement. Yep. It implements it. I'm not sure there's going to be much opportunity to change it once it's been signed. So it includes the following, the report includes this as well. It's a concern raised by the Australian Digital Alliance and the Australian Libraries Copyright Committee that contends that Parliament has a limited role in treaty making. It is unable to influence the negotiation process, the terms, or even the decision of ratification. The ability of Parliament to influence the implementing legislation is too little, too late. So I'll just summarise some of the concerns before passing over to Jock. The investor-state dispute system, as articulated by Wallach. The investor-state dispute resolution empowers corporations to sue governments outside of their domestic court systems over any actions the corporations believe undermines their expected future profits or their rights under the Pact, and we've talked about some precedents to that. The internet access, as articulated by the Australian Fair Trade Investment Network. Some proposals in the Trans-Pacific Partnership to extend copyright on the internet would reduce access to information. These rules would force internet service providers to police copyright rules by reporting breaches, removing online content, and even denying access to internet users. And some critics are worried that may shut whole families off the internet. And the final one, transparency and accountability. And this is another statement taken from the Productivity Commission 2010 Trade Report. In the Commission's view, a more transparent and strategic approach is required to ensure that there is an appropriate focus on policies that are most in Australia's interest. So I'll leave you with that, and we'll hear now what the other panel members have to say, and they'll talk more about these issues and their implications. So I'll hand over to Jock. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Matt, and thank you for the opportunity to talk at the seminar today. I'm just going to talk about one particular issue, cultural goods and services under the agreement. Primarily that means the services, investment and e-commerce chapters. I know Angela and others will talk about intellectual property, which is a matter of personal interest, but I just won't address it today. So I guess it's in a sense a small piece of a very, very big package of agreements, as is always the case now with bilateral free trade agreements, multilateral free trade agreements. These are now vast, complex documents. But I think it's a very important area and I think it's almost inevitably a controversial one. It certainly has been in all of the other trade agreements Australia has signed over the last 30 years. I really just want to make one point about this area, and that is about the importance of maintaining maximum policy flexibility for the future. The media, communications, audiovisual, content, digital industries, however we like to phrase that, these are industries in rapid change. They are industries in which the overall economics, some of the fundamental economic realities have been consistent over a long period of time. They are industries in which small economies have not been without remarkable performances from time to time, but they are industries in which products produced in Australia by Australians, by smaller countries in the international economy, often struggle to return their costs of production, and therefore various kinds of assistance measures have been put in place. Some sort of flexibility to be able to provide support measures to assist those industries in the future, I think, is vital. The precise mechanisms that we use in the future, I think, are highly uncertain. The mechanisms we have in place today may well not be the most appropriate for the future, but the need to retain policy-making flexibility so we can introduce, adapt, maintain policy measures for the future, I think, is vital. Trade agreements, however, are all about certainty for the long haul. They are forever. The agreements that Australia has signed, we have been part of all the major international multilateral trading arrangements signed since the Second World War. First of all, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. We did our own agreement with New Zealand in the 1980s, WTO, which Matt has referred to in the mid-1990s. Free trade agreements since then that have become the fashion since that point in the mid-1990s, and now the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the 2010s. Each of these agreements is made at a particular time. They reflect the historical circumstances, the relative power and interests of the parties that negotiate them at the time, but they tend to last forever. They are extraordinarily difficult to change, and that's the primary reason why I think maintaining flexibility in this industry, which I think matters a great deal, is so important. What might we expect at the moment with the Trans-Pacific Partnership? What is striking about this moment in history when we are negotiating this agreement, and it does appear that it may well be very close to the end game of this. My impression is that although people think there is an enormous amount of work still to be done, they are quite serious about the idea that this agreement might be locked up by the end of the year. The global economy is not in great shape. The United States, very powerful partner, clearly the most powerful partner in this negotiation, is, it would appear, if not in decline in absolute terms, in relative decline. So this agreement is extremely important to it, to put a stake in the ground and establish an agreement with like-thinking partners in the Asia-Pacific region. It's very powerful, however, continues to be enormously powerful in the audiovisual, information, communications industries, and they see those as extremely important to make some progress in this agreement. Trans-Pacific Partnership itself is a very unusual mix of large and small countries. What might happen is extremely unpredictable, I think. And finally, of course, we have a new government in Australia. While all governments are reluctant to make firm commitments about bottom lines in trade negotiations, this is a particularly uncertain moment because the government is so new. Just to speak then, how have we gone about doing this? Broadly, the agreements we've entered into have dealt with cultural goods and services in a range of different ways. It's incredibly complicated, but I'll just focus on two that I think are the kinds of ways that are most likely to happen or at least be talked about in this agreement. The first is you provide in the agreement or within the major parts of the agreement, the services and investment and electronic commerce chapters, you provide some sort of broad exception for cultural industries. creative industries, you obviously have to define those, but you have some sort of broad cultural exception that allows you to introduce the measures you feel are appropriate to support those industries in the future. The second way is much narrower. You say, you set out the particular policy measures, the particular things you retain the power to do in the future. Now, Australia has done the first of those in most of its bilateral free trade agreements. We've got a broad cultural exception in most of them. Not the case in New Zealand, where we are much, much more liberal, and hence, for example, New Zealand programs are treated as Australian programs for the purpose of domestic content quotas on Australian commercial TV. But in most of our free trade agreements, we have what we might call, they're all worded slightly differently, but we have something that is in the nature of a broad cultural exception or cultural carve-out. You will hear this term. The negotiation with the United States, however, AusFTA, Australia-US Free Trade Agreement, however, we have specified a set of policy measures, things that we are allowed to do. Now, that's quite an impressive list. Negotiators, I think, did quite well in that, but it is unquestionably a less expansive, it gives us less flexibility for the future. We have set out what it is we will do, and if we haven't specified what we will do, we can't do those things. So let me just give you the detail of words, and these are very wordy things, as you can imagine. So this is actually one of the more restrictive cultural carve-outs we have, the ASEAN New Zealand Australia Free Trade Agreement. Broadly, see those last words. We can maintain measures necessary to protect national treasures, specific sites, etc., measures necessary to support creative arts of national value. What does creative arts of national value mean? It means all of that. So it leaves you with a reasonably broad capacity to implement the measures that you think are appropriate to deal with it. That is my preferred approach. It's my understanding that that is the kind of thing Australia is arguing for in the negotiations. The second approach, the way Australia-US Free Trade Agreement works, is you set these things out. You say, we retain the right to provide subsidies, we retain the right to provide public services like the ABC and the SBS, we retain the right to have international co-production agreements which favour the parties to those agreements and not others. So we specify these things. Now, important to understand that has provided quite a good degree of protection for Australia. So it's not to say that the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement was a terrible result for Australia. The negotiators were very, very focused on ensuring that the primary measures were used and they thought we might use in the future, we retained the right to do those things. The fear for me is that was a result achieved by Australia one-on-one with the United States, and with a whole bunch of other parties around the table who might not give as much priority to this, we might not be so successful. So we might do worse in a negotiation with all of the TPP partners than we have done on our own with the United States. Not sure, we might do better, but I'm not at the table, so I don't know exactly the positions that are being put. Final slide then, so that is to think of the kinds of things that might be an issue for us and why this highlights the value of flexibility. What I've put under those are the things that we have done, the new things we've done since 2003 when the US Free Trade Agreement was signed off on. So we have changed quite a lot in our domestic audiovisual policy. We've changed all of those sorts of things, which have been quite substantial. If we had not retained the capacity to do that, we wouldn't have been able to do those things. So we've been able to change direction, introduce new policies, adapt existing ones, precisely because of the good negotiation, or the relatively good negotiation, I think, in difficult circumstances that was done at the time. The final slide, the difficult area, however, what happens for the future, especially for online services delivered into Australia? Now, some would argue that those kinds of services are beyond Australian influence. There's nothing much we can do about them. I would suggest that we have already demonstrated across a whole lot of areas of social policy in the economy that we care quite a lot about what happens online. So, for example, if Australian consumers are dudded by an international online service supplier, Australian consumer authorities will work with overseas consumer authorities to try and ensure some kind of redress. We see what is going on with concerns about taxation revenues in an online environment where revenue is being shifted around the world. It seems to me we are on the threshold of big rethinking about how we go about regulating industry globally. What we said in the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement was really we constrained ourselves quite tightly about what we would do in the future. Now, that language is complex, but if you think that the only circumstances in which we are able to intervene on questions about Australian content on online services is to ensure that Australian content is not unreasonably denied to Australian consumers, that is a fairly high benchmark to establish. That seems to me to be a very high benchmark. Better than nothing, but a very high benchmark. So I think it's this kind of language. If it's this kind of language that is brought to the table and the Americans were to say that's where we start, we want to do even better than that, that would be a matter of great concern. So in conclusion, I'm for trade agreements. I think trade agreements are important. I'm not opposed to the negotiation of trade agreements by any means. I understand well the argument that in a world without trade rules, the powerful tend to survive much better in a ruleless world than they do in one where there at least is some kind of constraint from a system of rules. But the kind of role that was played, I think, by national constitutions in the 18th and 19th centuries in setting out the way societies would rule themselves, I think trade agreements that we are signing in the late 20th and now 21st centuries, these are the documents which lay out the words that articulate the terms on which we will trade with the world. It seems to me to be enormously important that we get those words right. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott. We might have time for at least one question. Has anyone got a question for Jock? All right. Well, we'll move on to the next presenter, and then Jock may still be able to contribute to answering some of the questions that come up later anyway. So thank you. So this is William Davis, who is one of the Swinburne academics. He's going to talk about the e-commerce aspects of it.
Okay, like Matt said, I'm Bill Davis. I'm essentially coming at this from an international business point of view. I have been very involved in software commerce for quite a while, and I'm watching a lot of the things that happen normally as part of what I do in my work. But what I find so interesting about the TPP, I'm probably slightly different than you, Jock. I'm not so keen on these free trade agreements, but primarily I'm still keeping a foot in both camps. When we look at what NAFTA did in America, we lost a tremendous number of jobs, and I think jobs are going to be very, very important going on. Like you said, Jock, it's a very difficult situation that we're in. I'm using terms that are slightly different. We're here talking about the TPP, and the thing that bothers me the most is that they're negotiating this in secrecy. I don't think that's any way to do any type of a free trade agreement, and I don't see where we get a good outcome if we, the people, don't get a say. Now, I'm using some language that's come directly from these trade agreements that are trying to be done, and I've highlighted here that the TPIP that they're calling is the supposed European agreement. I've used TAFTA, which is another word they've used also for the European agreement. But I found that the language that they used, that the purpose of this agreement, and I'm actually bundling them because the U.S. is negotiating both of them at the same time. And I really found the language in which all regulatory differences between the U.S., the EU, and Asia Pacific are gradually removed, I don't see as a good thing at all. I think that we've got some information that's come from the U.S. Trade Representative that does indicate that that's probably not a very good thing for the rest of us. They consider it the biggest trade agreement in the world, and one of the things that I keep finding interesting is this started out supposedly having 26 chapters, of which at the most 2 to 5 really dealt with trade. The rest of them deal with the way that our corporations do business and the things that we as lesser parties will be asked to do. It's asking for a proactive requirement directing governments to change their laws. Matt mentioned earlier about the current case where at the moment Philip Morris is suing Australia over our plain packaging laws for cigarettes. They've been ruled out of really doing that here, so they've gone to Singapore and they're using the WTO laws to do so. As Jock said, these things don't die easily. Those WTO laws were actually written in an earlier agreement. They're still being used to try to enforce, even though we could come to no agreement with the Doha round. And the line that really got me out of this stuff was, we're going to put corporate stakeholders at the table with regulators to essentially co-write regulation in secrecy. As I said, I don't share Jock's positive look at that when the people that are doing the negotiation are also the people that they say are going to be judging the investment dispute system. So I think that's kind of dangerous as can be. The other thing is, as Matt said, we've been going to some of these stakeholder meetings, and I recognize a few faces from here that have also been there. One of the things that the DFAT people have said very clearly is that once we do this deal, its presentation to Parliament is going to be on a take it or leave it basis. We're not going to be able to say, well, we want to exclude the pharmaceutical benefit scheme from that. That's not clear at all at this point. So I'm a little bit worried about that take it or leave it spot, and I actually think that, Jock talks about the U.S. being at the center of negotiating these things. I don't know how any countries like Australia or New Zealand or many of the countries in this have any ability to stop it if the U.S. pushes hard enough for it. So I'm a little bit worried about that side. Now, Matt had brought up a lot about the controversial aspects of this being leaked, and the 2 chapters that were leaked were about the internet and one about, I missed the other one off, the investment. I think that as we've looked at what was leaked, they're actually quite scary documents. In the IP chapter, which, Angela, you're going to cover in detail, aren't you? Whoops, didn't mean for that to do. The clauses such as legal incentives for service providers to cooperate with copyright owners in deterring the unauthorized storage and transmission of copyrighted materials. I'm kind of against this only because we've watched what these things have done in the United States. We've watched them sue somebody who downloaded a few songs for $55,000 for somebody that was working, making $20,000 a year. I think Jock brought up the issues of how, Matt, you brought this up about how within a family we may lose an internet connection completely because our kid downloaded something. I find these to be ridiculous. And I think that when we look at the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, one of the things that just came out was that the proposals reveal that the U.S. does not recognize medicine that medicines are a public good. So if that's the position that the U.S. is taking and they bring us to this table, what chance do we have of keeping the PBS? I'm not quite sure about this. The controversial aspects of the ISDS to me are the worst here. When we went to the briefings, all of the DFAT people were saying, look, These things are, we're not going to agree to ISDS. Part of the problem with that is, Jockey brought up how we've just had a change of government. The one thing that the current government, the new government is bringing in is they're saying, we are for ISDS. In fact, I think I've got, yeah. At this point on the coalition trade policy, we're saying that we're remaining open to ISDS clauses. The coalition made clear elsewhere in the document, in truth, it appears gung-ho to wrap up as many free trade agreements as possible, as fast as possible, and to strongly favor inclusion of ISDS provisions. You know, I wasn't too sure about the Howard government when I first got here, but they stood up strongly to ISDS when they did the U.S. Free Trade Agreement. I'm concerned when I read about our government being upset about South Korea not being willing to go ahead for an agreement between us and them, and that Labor had refused to consider a proposal for ISDS. This worries me. I don't think we know. Part of the problem here is if we accept that we don't know and that they're doing this entire thing in secrecy, how does this have anything to do with democracy? I'm lost. I do love some of the Scandinavian countries are using terminology that I really love. They talk about free trade agreements primarily existing in a democracy deficit, and I think that's good wording. I was talking before about the tobacco issues and the U.S. Trade Representative's documents, and tobacco is certainly a part where it hurts us. Now, I'd like to just kind of briefly, and I'm probably not going to use all my time, talk about an agreement, a document that the U.S. Trade Representative released about trade in the Asia-Pacific region and what problems they had. Before I get fully into that, Matt, can you hand me that stack of papers, right? That first one? Yep, that's it. One of the things I want to shortly address before I get into this is there have been a couple of very interesting things come out recently. It seems that the U.S. is doing a very good job of encircling China with military bases. We've put a new drone base in very near China. I think that's in Japan and Australia seem to have a lot of control over these drones. Everyone but China has been the way that this negotiation has been handled so far. Matt, you put up on the list that China may be somebody coming into this. One of the things that was discussed in this was the docking provisions. And what we mean by a docking provision, Matt was talking about other countries that may come in. Any other country that comes into this, a docking legislation says that you can join the TPP, but you have to agree what everybody else has already agreed to. I think that doesn't give us enough room for the flexibility that Jock's talking about. When we see that America is encircling China right now, they've made a commitment to be stronger in the northern part of Australia, but not just Australia. It's Japan, it's quite a few other places. And when we talk about the fact that the U.S. approach to this so far has been that China won't sign on, when we look at China's position, they're going to lose either way. Now, they're one of our largest trading partners at the moment. If this TPP threatens our trade with China, I think that will hurt us, and I think we need to be very cautious about going forward with this. Now, what I'd like to do is just talk about this letter that came out from the U.S. Trade Representative. It was, Matt, it'll be right, next one down. No, next one down. That's it. This was put out in on April 5th, and it was put out by the U.S. Trade Representative's office. Now, the things that I found interesting in this, it was a fairly long document, and I didn't want to go too far into it, but one of the things that they brought up was they were really upset that in Vietnam, after the financial crisis, Vietnam tightened up the amount of money that their banks were required to keep in for all their, to be able to back up all their business. The U.S. Trade Representative is very upset that the American financial industry can't go in and rape the people in Vietnam on banking and financial industry. They're particularly blaming new capital adequacy requirements for causing difficulties for banks. Vietnam's banks kind of fell and hurt a little bit hard during the financial crisis, but their trade level wasn't up enough to completely kill them, but they made sure and passed common sense regulation of those things. It's also talked about Singapore for having the second lowest rate of software piracy in Asia. And you're going to talk a little bit about that, Angela, about software and what the Electronic Frontiers Foundation, did I spit that out right? Does. That's quite good work, but the report still alleges that Singapore has insufficient deterrent penalties for end user software. So when you get up, I'd like you to expand on that and tell me what that really means. Peru wants to protect their citizens' data. As all of us would have any association with the IT industry knows, the current buzzword of the moment is the cloud. Here in Australia, we, I believe, have regulations that say that we cannot store our private citizens' health data on servers outside of Australia that are not protected within Australia. In Peru, the U.S. Trade Representative specifically noted that the data privacy laws has caused concern among companies dependent upon cross-border data flows. Now, why should this matter? We've just watched this whole drama unfold with Mr. Snowden from the U.S., who's put out a lot of information on what the NSA has been spying on. We found that they were spying before trade negotiations on energy on Petrobras, which is the largest state-owned Brazilian oil company, and on all of the discussions between the representatives. Now, I know the spying goes on. I mean, most of us know that and are aware of it. But all of a sudden, putting something in the TPP to make certain that we don't have any barriers between these other large transnational corporations coming into Australia and putting our data on places that the U.S. government has the ability to spy on, just doesn't seem to make sense to me. Okay. On Mexico, they were upset about the oil and gas sector because the Mexican government, by their constitution, mandates that the state must own all oil and gas companies. But the U.S. trade officer says, well, it's wrong that they do that, and we want them to remove that law. The other Mexican law they don't like is that they don't want anybody within 50 kilometers of the nation coast to be able to buy up land, and the U.S. Trade Representative wants that to go away. Malaysia traditionally used procurement to support local businesses. Now they want that law removed if Malaysia is going to join the TPP. Also, the live trade issues that we've seen be so important and topical here, they want Malaysia to require that slaughter plants separate halal and non-halal for both transportation and live export trade to be indisputable, that nobody can gripe about that at all. In Chile, they're trying to amend the Internet Service Provider liability to permit effective action against any act of infringement of copyright and related rights. And the provisions would enable a sweeping crackdown on user-generated content as well, stifling innovation and restricting Internet freedom. What they're upset with us here is the cloud, the new health law barring offshore storage of confidential health records. And seeing as we have a very large investment in blood plasma fractionation, which I'm not quite sure what that means, but I know that CSR Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, CSL here, has been very involved in this for a long time, and it seems that they want to bring people to compete with that here in Australia with the Australian Red Cross. Now, I'm essentially through with what I really want to talk about, and we'll just have more time for panel discussion afterwards.
Okay, so
Okay.
all right, we'll move straight on to Angela, and then we might take some questions for the panel at the end in this case. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. I'm Angela Daly. I'm a research fellow here at the Swinburne Institute for Social Research, primarily working on law and technology, various aspects thereof. And I'm going to talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the specific copyright implications from what we've seen so far of the leaked texts. So just as an introduction, as we know, as has already been discussed, the Trans-Pacific Partnership contains an intellectual property chapter. It's one of the ones that's been leaked, in fact. And despite the secret negotiations that we've also heard about, it seems that particularly in this area, the large corporate copyright holders, particularly from the movie and music industries, have had this kind of privileged access to the text, while, on the other hand, the general public, civil society groups, and even politicians from national parliaments have not had this access. The latest picture of this chapter comes from two leaks, the major one from 2011 and another leak from 2012, but it's likely there have been some updates since the last leak, although nevertheless it seems that this is a particularly contentious chapter and there's not really been a lot of agreement on it. That's the rumours coming out of the negotiations anyway. The focus of my specific presentation is copyright. I'm not going to look at the other aspects of intellectual property, such as patents, which I believe may be covered in some of the later presentations, trademarks, geographic indications, etc. This is all about copyright. And just as an overview of the presentation, I'll firstly be looking at the content of the Trans-Pacific Partnership provisions on copyright. Then I'll give you some of my analysis and commentary on them, and I'll finish with my overall verdict. Okay, so looking at firstly at the content of these provisions, and firstly looking at the entrenchment of extended copyright terms, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, from what we gather anyway, will entrench the extension of copyright terms to the life of the author plus 70 years. This apparently has been part of Australian law for some time, since 2006, but it goes well beyond the standard life plus 50 years enshrined in the Berne Convention, and will bring all Trans-Pacific Partnership signatory countries in line with US law, which is this, some of which still have shorter copyright terms. Nevertheless, this has all been done in spite of the fact that copyright term extensions have been receiving a lot of criticism all over the world for delaying material going into the public domain and restricting the reuse and remix of older material into something which is new and innovative. As a result, this kind of extension will seemingly benefit established artists and corporate rights holders which have brought the rights from the original creators at the expense of emerging creators and the general public. Secondly, it seems that the Trans-Pacific Partnership also contains a proposal to ban parallel imports of genuine goods acquired from other countries without the authorisation of the copyright owners. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is supposed to be an agreement to promote free trade, but this kind of provision is actually a direct attack on free trade, encouraging protectionism of copyrighted material, and it will also ensure that Australian consumers continue to pay high prices for this kind of copyrighted digital content and software, as parallel importation, particularly into Australia, has been used as a way to access the same goods available at cheaper prices abroad. This kind of provision would also conflict with the recommendations in the recent Australian Parliament's IT pricing report, which was released earlier this year. One of these recommendations was to lift the remaining restrictions in our Copyright Act on the parallel importation of genuine items, so not counterfeited items, but genuine items. Furthermore, there was an interesting case from the US, either earlier this year or last year, Kurtzseying, in which the US Supreme Court held that textbooks, which were lawfully made and bought abroad, in this case Thailand, could be resold in the US without the permission of the copyright holder. So this provision would not even be in accordance with current US law. Thirdly, it seems that the Trans-Pacific Partnership also includes another provision that would prohibit temporary copies of copyrighted material being made, which includes temporary storage in electronic form. This kind of provision would actually impede the functioning of web browsers, which make these kind of temporary copies, otherwise known as caches, in their normal functioning. In the UK, where I am from, in fact, the Supreme Court recently decided that temporarily stored web pages, which contained copyrighted material, were actually not an infringement of copyright. Because otherwise, the other situation would be that millions of ordinary people who are using web browsers all the time would be infringing copyright every time, or literally or almost every time they browsed the web, which according to the judges would have been an unacceptable result. It seems to me at least that it's kind of utterly absurd to outlaw such a routine and unavoidable function that also doesn't really appear to be causing very much harm to the rights holders. But that's one of the tough on copyright piracy provisions that are seemingly contained within the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Another prohibition that would be entrenched by the Trans-Pacific Partnership would be the prohibition of the circumvention of technical protection measures which are used to protect digital copyrighted material. These measures, which act as kind of locks on this digital content, can include things like restrictions on music files which prohibit users from copying that file, on DVDs which prevent them being played in different geographic regions, and on ebooks which stop them being read aloud by the computer. It seems that the Trans-Pacific Partnership will contain some very limited exceptions to this rule, such as for researchers who are trying to ensure the interoperability of computer programs and to investigate security flaws. Now, technical protection measures can indeed protect against copyright infringement, but they can also stop plenty of perfectly legal uses of copyrighted material, and their circumvention can be done for legitimate reasons, such as to promote competition and facilitate innovation. Yet, according to what we've seen of the Trans-Pacific Partnership text, the breaking of a technical protection measure per se will be prohibited, seemingly even if it doesn't also constitute a copyright infringement. Nevertheless, a similar provision has been part of Australian law for some time, and the Attorney General here is currently reviewing exceptions to this rule on circumventing technical protection measures. However, it seems that if such a provision in the Trans-Pacific Partnership goes ahead, it could also cause a conflict with any new exceptions that come from this review, such as for format shifting and backing up legally bought digital content. A provision like this coming into Australian law might also conflict with recommendations in the recent IT pricing report that consumers should be explicitly allowed to circumvent these digital locks that control geographic market segmentation, and that a right of resale of digitally distributed content in Australia should be considered, since technical protection measures are often used to prevent this digital content being resold or passed on to other users. Fifthly, looking at fair use, fair use is not actually mentioned in the Trans-Pacific Partnership at all as an exception to copyright infringement. It's an exception to the exclusive right granted in US copyright law, which allows limited uses of the copyrighted material without having to ask the permission of the owner, and goes beyond what we currently have in Australian copyright law as the fair dealing exception. Earlier this year, the Australian Law Reform Commission actually recommended that an exception, a fair use exception, be introduced into Australian law. However, even if this does happen, it may not actually be of much consequence if it's not also included in the text of the TPP. In practice as well in the US, fair use has been restricted by similar measures to those proposed in the Trans-Pacific Partnership regarding the prohibition of the circumvention of technical protection measures. In the moment at the US, it's currently illegal to unlock your mobile phone or jailbreak your tablet, because since to do so, you would have to circumvent technical protection measures. In addition, it seems that Australia in particular, last year was actually supporting the US in trying to restrict the application of these so-called national exceptions to copyright infringement, despite the fact that its Law Reform Commission has actually recommended this being introduced into Australian law. Finally, with regards to copyright enforcement and the fight against piracy, it seems that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is trying to introduce a private system of copyright enforcement involving internet service providers and other online operators such as cloud providers, by involving them in the policing of copyright infringement by their users, including terminating the accounts of users who are repeat offenders and passing on personal information about these users to copyright owners. Seems anyway to me that such a provision as this coming into Australian law would mandate a massive filtering and surveillance programme of internet users, similar to that abandoned last year by the Australian federal government. It would also seem to go against the decision from 2 years ago in the IINet case regarding ISP's responsibility for infringing behaviour by their users, and furthermore would not seem to strike the correct balance between internet users' privacy on the one hand and the protection of intellectual property rights on the other. Okay, so just for some analysis now, or my analysis of some of these provisions. Firstly, I think the influence of the corporate lobbying can definitely be seen in the text. This corporate lobbying has come from major corporate copyright holders in the music and film industries in particular, and the language of the leaked text, such as the increase in copyright protection and the extension of copyright terms, definitely are of benefit to these institutions. As a result of this, unfortunately, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, from what we've seen anyway, fails to strike a much-needed rebalance between the interests of rights holders on the one hand, creators and internet users, and instead entrenches what are already not very good laws on copyright, going against plenty of empirical evidence. And so, to my way of thinking anyway, it represents a missed opportunity for positive change in the digital environment. Furthermore, these kind of very restrictive copyright laws have already been opposed in various parts of the world by the general public, including in the form of street protest in Europe anyway, such as the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, or ACTA, which seems to have been more or less abandoned due to this great kind of public feeling against it, and the aforementioned SOPA and PIPA in the US. But these provisions of copyright law and enforcement seem to be making a comeback in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Interestingly enough, there have already been protests against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and particularly these copyright provisions outside the negotiations in Peru earlier this year, and apparently more protests this week in Kuala Lumpur. Furthermore, these provisions do not really appear to be in the national interest of Australia, given Australia is a net importer of intellectual property, and the implementation and enforcement of these measures, the cost of this, will be borne by Australian institutions, whether it's us and our taxes, companies here, etc., but will predominantly be benefiting US-based rights holders. Furthermore, for the general public in Australia, we have very little information about what all of these copyright extensions, surveillance, law enforcement measures will actually cost us, the extent to which they'll be successful in encouraging creativity and innovation, which is supposed to be the purpose of copyright law, and what the overall benefits to society of such measures actually are. Indeed, the Australian government does not appear to be advocating for or carrying out the rigorous cost-benefit analysis of intellectual property provisions in free trade agreements recommended by the Productivity Commission in 2010. Finally, as is perhaps obvious, fair trade agreements don't really seem to have brought much in the way of benefits to Australians with regards to copyright content in particular. The previous free trade agreement with the US has not stopped US-based rights holders in particular from charging us a huge amount more for content and software compared to American consumers, as we've seen from the IT pricing report. So just to conclude, my overall verdict on this is that we had an opportunity here, particularly in the context of a multilateral trade agreement, to offer updated copyright laws for what is now a transnational digital reality. But in fact, the provisions of the Trans-Pacific Partnership continue this distortion of copyright law and the rort of normal Australians in favour of big, mainly US-based corporations, copyright holders, and they should definitely be opposed rather than embraced, as seems to be currently the case by the Australian government. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions for any of the panel members? Yes?
I have a comment that really is about language. I have a real problem.
I'll just stand here so the mic will pick it up.
I have a real problem with us calling this agreement anything to do with trade. As the third speaker pointed out, most of the content of the 21 chapters is actually about regulation, not about trade. And I understand from DFAT consultations a few weeks ago that they haven't actually begun to address the market access issues. So I think it would be helpful if we're very careful with our language and do not refer to this as trade, and certainly do not refer to it as free trade, because if it has anything to do with trade, it is a preferential trade agreement. And coming from that, it's very important to remind ourselves of something that is often forgotten about why is freer trade beneficial. Freer trade is not beneficial because we get to sell more hamburgers to America. Freer trade is beneficial when we bring our tariffs down and we increase competition in our domestic market, and those lower prices flow through all the consumers and all the businesses who then get to be more competitive. So the reason that you look for these free trade is because you get a lever to advocate domestic reform. And that is simply the obverse of the kinds of restraints of competition and trade that are coming under this language of rights holders, who are actually people who have the privilege of imposing a restraint on competition for life plus 70 years. So we have to be very, very careful about our language, or we'll go in completely the wrong direction in talking about this. I mean, people fall into it, they say it's trade, there has to be a benefit. You come across businessmen like the man who heads the Australia-European Business Association, who wants free trade agreements. He doesn't understand the first thing about IP chapters or or investor dispute resolution mechanisms for foreign direct investment.
All right. Thank you. Did. Shall we take that more as a comment? Thanks. Yeah, sure.
Two of the speakers mentioned corporate involvement in the negotiation, and I think you mentioned that some of the rights holders have been shown the text, but just on the DFAT website it says corporations aren't involved, they have not shared the negotiating text with corporations or anyone else. So what's the
So what is the role of corporations in this?
Well, essentially, from my understanding of the way that it's working, is that there are approximately 600 negotiators that are basically from large transnational corporations that are seeing the agreements. The reason the first one was leaked on IP was actually one of the U.S. Congressman Darrell Issa, who's a conservative politician, leaked the document. And my understanding is that the reason he leaked it was because the people that were on the trade committees in the United States couldn't see the text. When Matt and I went to the TPP stakeholder briefings, they could not even discuss the text. In fact, I happen to have the letter that the New Zealand Trade Minister wrote, and the language was explicit. It said, all participants agree that the negotiating text, proposals of each government, accompanying explanatory material, emails related to the substance of the negotiations is provided will be held in confidence unless each participant involved in a communication subsequently agrees to its release. These documents may be provided only to government officials or persons outside the government who may participate in that government's consultation process. And the policy underlying the approach is to maintain the confidentiality of the documents while at the same time allowing the participants to develop their negotiating positions and communicate internally and with each other. We look forward to your confirmation that you agree with this approach. And this was from Mark Sinclair, the TPP lead negotiator for New Zealand. So I think that there are a group of people that are negotiating this that work for, as Angela said, the corporate interests that are putting this text into everything. The slide that I had specifically talked about that, in that they were not only not willing to share that, but that many of these same groups of people are the exact people that would be in charge of, say, the ISDS and the way that we dispute these. So they act as both judge and advocate, and there seems to be no real sharing with the public whatsoever. I want to bring up that as part of this, Matt talked about the WTO, and several of the negotiators, but specifically the last U.S. trade representative before Mike Froman, who's the current one, said specifically, we cannot allow the TPP to be discussed in the same way that we allowed the WTO negotiations to be discussed. When we allowed the public to see the texts, too many people were upset and we never had a chance to get the Doha round done. So it's more or less, if we tell you what's in it, you won't want to sign it.
I would just kind of answer, perhaps somewhat flippantly, even if DFAT itself says that they're not showing it to corporations, doesn't mean any of the other negotiating governments aren't, for instance, and that's assuming you believe what they're telling you as well, but we'll leave that.
Look, there are a few questions. How about we take a break, because at the end of the next panel session we can still take questions for those who want to ask them, and we'll just take a short break now and we'll switch panels over and then we can come back to those questions, so please do hang on to them. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming along and for staying for the second session, which will be a very interesting session, I think. Not that the first one wasn't, but so we have Nick Rose, who'll be starting that session from the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance.
Thanks very much, Matt, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to Matt and colleagues from Swinburne for organising this forum. And I don't think Matt actually mentioned it, but it is intended. It is actually the first civil society public discussion on this agreement in Australia. Is it fair to claim that? Or
I think it's the first one. Yeah.
It's the first one. Okay, I think you should have said that right at the start, because I think that's given the nature of this agreement and its importance for all of us and for the country. I think it's very valid and timely that this discussion is taking place. So it's pleasure for me to be here and be able to hopefully make a small contribution to it. This year has actually been a few firsts, including this one. A couple of months ago I was in Melbourne at the Treasury Theatre, I think that was, in East Melbourne, just behind Parliament, speaking at what I believe was the first symposium in Australia on supermarket power. Was that right, Carly? Yeah, that was really interesting, an open discussion about the role of supermarkets and the amount of power they have and the way they exercise it in the Australian food system. These are questions that we need to be raising and debating, and I think for me that's really the point about the discussion tonight, where I'm coming from to this topic as, I guess, a food movement activist in Australia, somebody who's been promoting the cause of food sovereignty, which is a global movement that came into existence very much opposed to the whole free trade agenda back in the mid-1990s as the result of cultural exchanges between women farmers largely in Canada and Europe and Central America, Nicaragua. And the reason that they created La Via Campesina, which is Spanish for the farmer path or the peasant path, was because they could see the whole free trade agenda was going to be very damaging and destructive to their livelihoods, as in fact it's turned out to be. So I guess I'm being fairly provocative and even polemical in what I'm going, my comments tonight, in the spirit of trying to provoke some discussion and debate around this topic. So my subtitle there, An Exercise in Legalised Plunder and Wealth Transfer, really picks up on some points that were made in the first panel discussion about, this is really a question about power, about political economic power at a national and a global level, and this agreement is about who is making these decisions and in whose interests. And I think that's for me, that's the approach that I'm coming from in relation to it. So we've had quite a lot of detail actually about the text of the agreement, what's emerged so far. So I'm going to, in the first part of my presentation, step back a little bit and look at the wider historical context and try and sort of give it some broader historical perspective before looking in a bit more detail about what it might mean for food and agriculture in Australia, and then at some of the alternatives that might exist and that myself and colleagues from the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance have been involved in promoting over the last couple of years. I forgot to say the other first tonight is that this is the first time I've used Prezi, which I'm quite excited about, and said if you're not familiar with new technology, ask your 11-year-old son. Well, I've got a 12-year-old son, and he's just using it at high school, and he took me through this this software, so I'll just have to see how it goes. But it's looks pretty interesting. So, as I said, for me, it's and for the Food Sovereignty Alliance, it's really sort of like this dichotomy between this free trade agenda and this emerging discussion around fair trade. Not so much in the narrow certification concept of it, but more in a sort of like from a question of values and principles and priorities. Questions such as what do we really want our food system to be about? What do we really want our economy and our society to be about? What are the real important goals, and how do we measure questions of societal progress and well-being? So I've recently finished a PhD, and this is perhaps my proudest achievement in the whole 6 years of it, that when I'd finally completed it, I was able to reduce half of it to one Venn diagram, and I was thinking maybe that should be part of the completion requirement for any new PhD student, to see if they can condense their PhD into one graphic. It certainly focuses the mind. So for me, the point of this was really to try and focus my attention at least on questions of causation, because that's what I understand the role of social science to be, not just to describe the world as we see it, but to try and look a bit deeper and to see what the causal processes are at work. So the point of this was to say, well, there are certain things happening in the world around us. There's climate change, which is taking place increasingly rapidly. There's questions of dietary-related ill health. There's hunger. There's food safety scares, and so on. But why are those things happening? Let's go a little bit deeper. And so the chain of causation for me goes, from the blue inner core outwards, and it's really for me flows from a basic sort of disconnection, and the food system as it's evolved, I think, is premised on very much a sense of separation or alienation, disconnection from the land, disconnection from each other, lack of knowledge about what we're eating, what it's doing to our bodies, the conditions of farmers, and so on. A whole series of cascading disconnections. Where we want to be going with the different food system is trying to get more connected. So, and of course, that disconnection has meant that as a culture, and I'm not speaking of anybody individually, but as a culture, as society, our highest value is really around money. And money is a really interesting topic, and I think we could do to have perhaps some forums exploring the role of money in our life and society. But I look back to Aristotle, who came up with this interesting distinction over 2,000 years ago between oikonomia, which is where our word economy comes from. It's the Greek word oikos is the root, meaning the home, and that's also the root word of ecology, interestingly enough. So ecology being the oikos logos, the law of the home, and oikonomia, the management of the home. And the idea from that, the economy being about managing our resources for the benefit of everyone. And Aristotle contrasted that with crematistics, which is really the art of getting rich and pursuing short-term monetary gain. And I think if we reflect on what our economy is at the moment, it's much closer to crematistics than to oikonomia. So these words that were written 150 years ago, I think they were true then, and they're true now. We often hear about the world changing so rapidly all around us, but there are some things that do remain constant, and I'll apologise to any French speakers who may be in the audience. So I think the French captures this better than English. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. That title there is really describing the laws of our economy. We often hear about a triple bottom line or even a quadruple bottom line, but I think really there's really one bottom line, and that is accumulation of capital and profit. And what Marx also said about accumulation, or one of the many things he said, was accumulation of wealth and riches at one pole is accompanied by accumulation of misery and toil at another. I think we see that in relation to the growth of the genetically modified industry, with Monsanto's profits growing year on year, and yet the numbers of Indian farmers committing suicide because of the debt they've got into trying to grow the BT cotton is now approaching in the order of 300,000. So in this era of free trade, we've seen a phenomenal increase, and of neoliberalism generally, we've seen a phenomenal increase in wealth in this century alone. You can see the numbers of billionaires have trebled, and their collective wealth has nearly quadrupled, and a staggering concentration of the world's wealth in a tiny fraction of the world's population. This is a recent report that came out from Credit Suisse, just showing the global wealth pyramid and just how distorted that distribution is, the extent of inequality in the modern world. All right, so turning then to agriculture, and these reflections come from a really good article that I'd recommend to anyone who's interested in this area from Jason Moore, published in the Journal of Agrarian Change a couple of years ago. Really looking at a broad historical context of the development of agriculture and the respective revolutions that it's gone through, and he sees a dynamic of what he calls productivity and plunder. So that's increases in productivity and technological change, which has happened in different phases, looking at English and American agriculture revolutions, notably, I guess, the Haber-Bosch discovery of fixing of nitrogen in the second decade of the 20th century, and then more recently the Green Revolution and the hybrid seeds and the whole sort of irrigation and fertiliser package, which led to a big leap in productivity for a short period of time. But then he goes a bit more deeper to say, well, why is this happening and what's its role? Well, it's the production of this thing he calls the ecological surplus, which is what really enables our consumer-based economy to expand, because we need to keep down the price of food. Because if we can spend less of our wages on food, then we've got more to spend on all the other disposable items. And that's really the key challenge going forward for the big food system, to keep that cost of food down as much as possible. That's the productivity side of it. Now the plunder side of it, that's the expansion, that's the taking over of land, earlier processes of colonisation, of imperialism, and it's continuing today. We might have thought that imperialism happened in the past, but now we've got this global land grab, which has really taken off in the last 15 years or so, again coinciding with the era of free trade, where we've got all these foreign land deals largely in countries in the global south, and most of them, as you can see, are only are not for growing of food, but rather for growing of biofuels and other commodities for export. Who's involved? Well, if you can see that all right, the investor countries are there. USA takes pride of place, followed by Malaysia, largely rich world countries. And where are they going to buy the land? Some of the poorest countries in the world, top of the list being Papua New Guinea. Okay, so this quote actually comes from a lady I met a couple of years ago when I was in Timor-Leste, talking. She's part of the youth wing of the Japanese Family Farmer Organisation, and she was talking about the anticipated impact of the Trans-Pacific Partnership on Japan and on Japan's smaller scale producers. And that quote actually refers to a post-war reconstruction program that the United States was imposing on Japan, because they saw the culture of eating rice as a big impediment to American exporters, and Japan having a food self-sufficiency rate of 73% in 1965. That was an impediment to trade and the interests of American corporations. So they came up with this national campaign to try and teach the Japanese to eat wheat rather than rice, and that was one of the slogans that they used. And those are the projections in terms of the impacts, the anticipated impacts that the TPP will have on Japan's capacity to feed itself going forwards. We've heard already about NAFTA in terms of the impacts on smaller scale producers. We've heard from Bill about the impact on American jobs. Well, the flood of subsidised cheap corn going into Mexico led to a huge exodus of smaller scale maize producers from the Mexican countryside, many of whom have become so-called illegal migrants going into the United States, and that's caused all kinds of other issues and racial tensions. La Via Campesina have a saying: the mass movement of food leads to the mass movement of people and hardship and poverty on the farmland. It's worth mentioning that there's 1 billion hungry people in the world, and the majority of those are actually farmers themselves, smaller scale producers. And part of the reason for that is this free trade agenda. So in terms of Australia, this is actually a banana farmer from where I come from, or not where I come from, where I'm living at the moment, up on the Coffs Harbour region, which used to produce 90% of Australia's bananas. His father was one of the first to move from Sydney in the 1930s, producing bananas. And he told me when I interviewed him that Woolgoolga, just north of Coffs Harbour, according to the Australian census of 1952, was actually the richest per capita place in the country on the basis of agriculture. Not anymore, because the price for bananas, as it has for most food products in Australia, has essentially stayed flat for the best part of 3 or 4 decades. And so you have that quote up in the top right-hand corner there, which I think is quite a stark commentary on the way our food system has developed, that we're really forcing our farmers to become on this endless production treadmill to produce so much more just to make ends meet. And in fact, 70% of them don't make ends meet and are forced to rely on off-farm income. So those are some of the demographic changes. Young people don't want to go into agriculture in this country, and we're losing farmers at a pretty rapid click. Nearly 20,000 farmers in Australia left the land in the last 5 years, and that rate of exodus is expected to double over the next decade. Oops, sorry. Okay, so here we go. Some alternatives. Let's try and go out a little bit. So are there alternatives? Well, clearly there are, and I think the first point to make about this is that there's a growing discourse that is really questioning the whole societal focus on growth. You know, this is the New Economics Foundation, a think tank in the United Kingdom, that came out with 2 reports, one in 2005 called Growth Isn't Working, and this one a few years later called Growth Isn't Possible, which is really raising questions about the actual capacity of the earth and our physical systems to actually continue supporting an economic system that depends on doubling itself every 20 years or so, based on a 3% normal growth rate. And then you have another author from the same school, Richard Heinberg, who focuses particularly on the question of oil and peak oil and the constraints that will pose on future growth. And in fact, some of these people are saying that, you know, the GFC happened a few years ago now, but we're still not returned to growth. We may be going into another period of growth, recession. Greece, for example, is going backwards massively. Japan hasn't gone forward for 20 years. Perhaps we're already in the post-growth era. This is one of the alternatives, and this really does relate to the point that was made earlier about the TPP and its restrictions on the capacity of states and governments to preference local suppliers. This is a trend that's emerging in the United States, where you've got states like Illinois that have had whole of society discussions, multi-stakeholder meetings about what they want their food and farming systems to look like and the outcomes they want them to achieve. And they actually legislated at the state level for a local food, farms and jobs Act, and on the basis of that created a new council, a multi-stakeholder council charged with the implementation of that Act to achieve the goals that you see set out there, and some of its responsibilities include to assist local farm and food entrepreneurs to identify and secure necessary resources and equipment, to begin, maintain and expand projects and networks necessary for the development of local farm or food products, facilitate the use of public lands for growing local farm or food products by working with government entities at local, state and federal levels, and so on. These are the sorts of things, legislation and initiatives, that could well be threatened by the conclusion of the TPP. These are the sorts of things that we're trying to promote in Australia with the People's Food Plan, the development of food systems that are really based on values of ecological sustainability, of foregrounding health and well-being, and supporting our farmers and food producers through such things such as councils and state governments adopting preferential procurement policies. But this is the kind of agenda that may very well be undermined and threatened by the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So this is another first that happened this week, that we're involved in the Fair Food Week, which involved about 15,000 people around Australia in 112 different events, having discussions and activities around the concept of a fair food system and what that might mean. There's 1 minute. Yep, nearly finished. And this is the last slide, and here this is picking up on going a bit sort of left field. It's a cell biologist, Bruce Lipton, who wrote a book called Spontaneous Evolution, and that's really that metaphor of the caterpillar and the butterfly is really back to this question of what kind of choices we want to make in terms of our priorities and our values as a society going forwards. The metaphor of the caterpillar is that it's an organism that at a certain point in its life reaches a maximum stage of physical quantitative growth, and then inside the caterpillar it enters into a stage of breakdown, but there are certain cells called imaginal cells that set that organism on the path to its evolutionary leap to become a butterfly. And he transposes that to humanity as a whole to say, at this point in our evolutionary journey, we're at that crossroads, we're at that point of choice where we can either try to keep going and maintain the caterpillar, business as usual, the free trade agenda, or we can try and make an evolutionary leap to become something different and more sustainable and fair, and that's the butterfly. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Deborah is from La Trobe University, and she's going to talk about health. Yep. Right with.
Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. And thank you very much, Matthew, for organising the event. It's widely acknowledged that the TPP negotiations present a significant threat to access to affordable medicines. So much so that Médecins Sans Frontières, the humanitarian organisation, has warned that the TPP has the potential to become the most harmful trade pact ever for access to medicines at the global level. Leaked documents show that the United States Trade Representative is seeking extreme intellectual property protections for pharmaceutical companies that would prolong monopoly periods and delay the availability of cheaper generic medicines in the TPP countries. And the US has also sought provisions that would constrain the operation of pharmaceutical pricing and reimbursement schemes like Australia's PBS and Pharmac in New Zealand. Also, an investor-state dispute settlement procedure that you've heard about before in the previous presentations could provide new avenues for the pharmaceutical industry to challenge decisions and recommendations regarding drug patents and medicine policy. So this presentation outlines the proposals that the US has made in each of these areas and their potential impact on access to medicines in Australia and the other TPP countries. I should introduce myself before I go any further. As well as being an academic in the School of Public Health and Human Biosciences at La Trobe, I also convene a special interest group in the Public Health Association of Australia called the Political Economy of Health Special Interest Group of PHAA. And in that role, I represent the Public Health Association of Australia on the health issues associated with the TPP. So what I'm going to talk about today is firstly to give you a very brief overview of some of the health issues associated with the TPP, and then a little bit of background about trade agreements and medicines. And then I'm going to cover three areas where the TPP, where the US has made proposals for the TPP that would impinge on access to medicines. The intellectual property chapter, an annex to the transparency chapter on pharmaceutical pricing and reimbursement, and the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. And then I'll just talk a little bit about Australia's position in relation to these issues. So there are many areas of the TPP that would have an impact on health. As other speakers have mentioned, there are something like 29 chapters or negotiating areas under discussion and over 1,000 pages of text, I believe, already. There are many different areas that could have an impact on health. And what I'm mainly going to talk about today is that those first three chapters on the list. There's also a technical barriers to trade chapter, a chapter on state-owned enterprises, and many other chapters that would also have risks for things like alcohol health warnings, tobacco control policy, public health services, and so on. And at the end of my presentation, I've got a list of links, and you can have a look at some of those links if you're interested in some of the other issues. Now, just a little bit of background about trade agreements and medicines. The pharmaceutical industry has sought for many years to pursue its interest through trade negotiations. And the World Trade Organisation's TRIPS agreement, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, was introduced in 1995, and that put in place enforceable standards for intellectual property protection, including 20-year patents for new medicines. But the TRIPS agreement allowed countries a certain amount of flexibility in how they implemented those principles, and it had some safeguards, which the TPP would not necessarily allow countries to still continue to use. Now, through successive trade agreements since the TRIPS agreement, the US in particular, also the EU, have sought to increase the intellectual property privileges that pharmaceutical companies have. And they've also, the US has also, through recent trade agreements, including the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement and its bilateral agreement with South Korea, has attempted to influence pharmaceutical coverage programs like the PBS and South Korea's scheme for subsidising medicines and medical devices. Now, the US TPP proposals are more extreme than any of the previous trade agreements. And this is in a trade agreement that includes developing countries, countries like Vietnam and Peru and Malaysia, which already have significant problems in terms of providing affordable medicines to their populations. Now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the intellectual property proposals that would affect medicines. So Angela earlier talked about the copyright provisions in the intellectual property chapter, but it also has a section on pharmaceuticals. I won't talk in detail about the sorts of provisions that are proposed in that chapter, but in many different ways, these provisions would expand the scope of what can be patented, expand the period of time that medicines and other things are protected by patents, and would delay the availability of generic medicines. So we'd see patents lasting for longer, and when a patent is in place, cheaper generic versions can't be produced of that substance. We'd see medical procedures being patented, patents would be more difficult to challenge, and the end result would be the delayed market entry of cheaper generic medicines. So we'd see higher costs for governments in terms of pharmaceutical expenditure, higher costs for health services, and higher costs for consumers. And we know from previous research that when the costs of pharmaceuticals rise, particularly if co-payments rise, the amount that you pay when you go to the pharmacist to get your prescription, if that amount goes up, then disadvantaged people suffer the most. In terms of the proportion of their income that they need to spend on pharmaceuticals, particularly people who have chronic illnesses and might need to purchase a lot of different medicines each month. And it's a socioeconomically disadvantaged people who suffer when the cost of medicines go up. And often those people delay the purchase of medicines and their health outcomes can suffer. Of course, the effects are much worse in developing countries where medicines can be far out of reach of many people. In addition to the intellectual property chapter, the US has also proposed an annex to the transparency chapter of the TPP. And this contains a lot of different provisions that would have an impact on the PBS. So there's wording in that chapter that would prevent the PBS from using a practice called therapeutic reference pricing, where the prices of new drugs are linked with the prices of drugs that are already available, the cheaper drugs that are already available for the same condition. So not having access to therapeutic reference pricing would mean that the PBS would really struggle to keep prices down. The US wants to introduce a new independent appeals process that would give pharmaceutical companies the ability to challenge the pricing and listing recommendations for the PBS. And there are a whole set of onerous obligations for disclosure and what the US likes to call transparency that would have an impact on how well the pharmaceutical benefit scheme is able to prevent the pharmaceutical companies from influencing its decisions. The US would also like to mandate direct-to-consumer advertising of medicines via the internet. And that's a practice that's only allowable in the US and New Zealand at the moment because it can lead to overprescribing of pharmaceuticals and can also add to pharmaceutical expenditure. So what would all of this mean? It would mean reduced government control over medicines policy, new avenues for the pharmaceutical industry to influence decision making around medicines, higher costs to government and consumers, or we might have to see restrictions on access to drugs, and the sustainability of the PBS and Pharmac in New Zealand would be threatened. For developing countries which don't have these sorts of schemes in place already, we'd see restrictions on their ability to introduce the best types of schemes in future. But the really outrageous thing about all of this is that the US is actually seeking to carve out its own drug programs. So it's proposing to impose constraints on the drug programs of other countries that wouldn't affect its own schemes. Now, the investor-state dispute settlement you've heard quite a bit about already. It provides an opportunity for industry to challenge unfavourable decisions about drugs that are not listed on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme or prices that they don't like. It could provide an opportunity for them to challenge reforms to pharmaceutical policies and regulatory processes. If we introduced changes to the PBS to bring prices down, they could be open to challenge. And also decisions regarding patents. And the Eli Lilly company in the US, big pharmaceutical company in the US, has sued Canada for $500 million because the Canadian government revoked a patent on a particular drug. So, and the existence of this mechanism in itself might be sufficient to undermine the best type of pharmaceutical policy making, and also policy making around a lot of other public health issues like tobacco control, alcohol regulation, food regulation, those sorts of issues. Now, the former Australian Labor government had issued a trade policy statement in April 2011 that made some specific commitments around health and social and environmental issues. And it specifically mentioned that the Australian government would not accept provisions that would limit its capacity to put health warnings or plain packaging requirements on tobacco products, or its ability to continue the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. And this position was maintained throughout the negotiations, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade negotiators seemed to be sympathetic to the particular needs of developing countries. But it was unclear how much support would actually be offered to the developing countries in the negotiations. The coalition's government's position on the TPP has not yet been announced. There hasn't been a change to the Australian government's positions so far since the election. But the coalition's policy for trade, which came out on the day before the election, said that the coalition will take a pragmatic approach to trade negotiations and will consult widely with industry bodies and associations to ensure that stakeholder priorities are taken into account. You'll notice there's no reference there to civil society, stakeholders, non-government organisations, health experts. The coalition, as you would have heard earlier, is open to utilising investor-state dispute settlement clauses as part of Australia's negotiating position, and there's no mention of health, medicines, the PBS, or tobacco plain packaging, or any other health, social or environmental issues in the coalition's trade policy statement. Thank you. So what are Australian health organisations doing about this? Well, we've been very active over the last couple of years. Just before the APEC meeting that was held last week, we sent a letter to Tony Abbott that was signed by the Public Health Association of Australia, the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network, and 4 other large Australian health organisations, setting out the issues that we're concerned about and the positions that we think the Australian government should take on each of those issues. And of course the two biggest issues for us are about medicines and also about investor-state dispute settlement. We also, several organisations also made a submission to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade at the beginning of October on intellectual property and medicines, specifically indicating to the Australian government the position that we think it should take on these issues at the moment in the negotiations. So just to conclude, there are three areas of the TPP that could compromise access to affordable medicines, the particular areas that I've mentioned. If the position of the previous government is maintained, it's likely to result in reasonable outcomes for Australia. It was unclear how much the Australian government would support the developing countries involved in the negotiations. The coalition government's approach is unknown at this point, hasn't declared what the priorities are for the TPP. And there's a growing network of Australian health organisations that are engaged in advocacy around these issues. And if people would like to take some action following this seminar, AFTINET, the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network, has a campaign where people can send a letter to the Trade Minister, Andrew Robb, on their website. So I've put the link up there. So if you just Google the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network, you'll come up with that link. So just some of my publications on the TPP. I don't know if you're making these slides available
We can make them
afterwards.
available, yeah. So, yeah, if you're happy to do
And my
that.
contact details. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Deborah. Just while Bob gets set up here, is there any questions for either Deborah or Nick at this point? Yeah? You've got one? Yeah?
Other than that letter, if there was one other contribution that we could make to stop the restriction of the 3DS and to enhance it and enshrine it to the Australian Constitution, what would you have us do? And will you please advertise the next editorial on 3CR, please? And finally, speaking of ISDS, what indicators in the TPP relates to the BIS or the FSB bail-in recommendations and abiding government legislation similar to the New Zealand Open Bank Resolution with a Cyprus banking results, since Australia does not have the strength of a 1949 Portuguese constitution? Thank you very much.
On the first part of that question, AFTINET, as well as having the letter that people can send to the Trade Minister, there's also a package of information that people can take to their MPs and talk to their MPs about the issues. So that's probably the best thing to do if you have time to do that. Sorry, I'm missing the microphone, aren't I? So AFTINET has the letter and also a package of information that people can take to their MPs to talk about the issues. What was the second part of your question? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Will you please advertise the next conference earlier on 3CR's ratings?
Okay, so I think that's a point for Matthew to advertise on 3CR if there's going to be another event. And,
Yeah, thank you.
And I think the third part of your question was about banking, which I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer.
Or anyone else on the panel about bail-in applications, specifically the New Zealand Open Bank Resolution, where there is Australian legislation going towards that point.
So, sorry, just state that again, sorry, because I missed that for the microphone. Yep.
Sure. Speaking of ISDS, what indications in the TPP relate to the BIS and FSB bail-in recommendations and abiding government legislation similar to the New Zealand Open Bank Resolution with a Cyprus banking result, since Australia does not have the strength of a 1949 Portuguese constitution? Thank you.
Does anyone want to take that question on, or no? We might pass on it for now, and we'll see if someone can get back to you later on. And yeah, sure, yeah. All right, thank you.
Can I just check something about Andrew Robb's position on the investor-state dispute resolution issue? Because I was referred by email to an article by Peter Martin in an interview with Robb, where Robb said, well, no, he wouldn't be backing that investor-state dispute resolution, because I then emailed Rob and said, oh, thank goodness, you've really relieved me. But I do think that people should be emailing their own member and anyone they know about in government about any issue that's of concern to them, and particularly the issue about tying the hands of all future generations to do any domestic reform, whether it's on banking or anything else.
Thank you.
I just understand.
Oh, sure, if you want to. I don't know whether they've got anything. Which one is it?
All right. Well, we better move on to the other two presentations. Thank you. We'll have some more questions at the end of these two as well. Thank you.
So there's a petition on the file, so I can get the link up later.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, Paul.
That's all right.
We'll bring the link up for the petition later.
You'll have to do it again now, Matt. Sorry. I'm a Mac person myself.
We'll forgive you.
Thanks.
It's all right, Paul.
So this is
I
Bob
want
Felt.
to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as well. I've got it, I think. Still their land that we're on. I had a couple of other remarks before I open too, really. I think the person who made the point about us calling this a free trade agreement is spot on. I think we just have to recast the language because, as AFTINET itself points out, the internal corporate transfers dominate this so that companies are moving products within their own corporate structures and resources to minimise tax especially. And it's just no longer acceptable that people like Google can make tens of millions of dollars in Australia and pay no tax. Billions. Okay, billions. I don't mind. And not just them, but everybody else. This has got to be part of this picture as well. If they're doing business, they have to pay their tax. Nick's showing the number of billionaires. That doesn't happen by chance. It's the way the structure is fixed. So it's about taking people's power. Maybe that's what TPP should stand for, or something. I'm sure we can work on that. So I wanted to talk about, I'm from Genethics, so we've been campaigning for 25 years about genetically manipulated crops and foods, and I suppose that's the main focus tonight. We're part of, Fran and I are both part of the GM Free Australia Alliance, and of course we care about regulation. We've got some regulations in Australia, but Food Standards Australia and New Zealand will accept virtually any kind of data on which to approve every application that's been made to it for the introduction of genetically manipulated foods into Australia. And similarly with the Office of Gene Technology Regulator, it's just woeful what a so-called science-based system will accept as evidence of safety and environmental friendliness. It's not acceptable, and that's why we're very gung-ho for keeping our laws, deficient as they are, in place, and indeed strengthening them, not making them weaker. However, the Washington-based biotech industry organisation had a very, very clear agenda which it published and which it put to the American government at the beginning of this TPP negotiation, and which the American government understandably accepted, because Tom Vilsack, the Agriculture Secretary, for instance, has been in the GM area for a long time, both as a governor, got big prizes for promoting biotechnology, and in the industry as well. I think you've all heard about the revolving door of the American situation. Hillary Clinton's another major booster of this aspect of technology. Her old law firm represented Monsanto and many others. So we've also white-anted as well, because the Queensland and Victorian governments, and indeed, I don't know whether it's still true, but certainly previously, the Victorian Premier was a member of the Biotechnology Industry Organisation as well. So Australian public policy reflects much of what the Biotech Industry Organisation wanted to do. We are now told by DFAT that in fact manipulated crops and foods are not part of the negotiation, and they've reiterated that constantly, but our concern is that this new government will take a different view about it. They're even more gung-ho at promoting these kinds of innovations, nanotechnology, food irradiation, synthetic biology, and a range of other things than even the ALP was, which was gung-ho enough. So Bio wants a common regulatory approach under the treaty. That means the American approach, which is no regulation at all. Basically, it's industry self-regulation. They want to, as they say, remove asynchronous approvals between the parties. So it would mean that if something was approved in the USA, then it would very likely just more or less flow on to the other parties as well, and would be a foregone conclusion. So our national regulators, pathetically weak as they are, would then become even more irrelevant. All barriers to trade in agricultural biotechnology products, regulatory frameworks, streamlined, objective, science-based. That means not scientific, actually. Science-based means not scientific. You don't set any benchmarks or standards by which you will judge the data that's given to you by the applicant. So, for instance, I just did one on soybean, and the animal feeding study that was given was not criticised by anybody, even though it had 20 animals, chickens, and was interested in their slaughter weight after 42 days. 7 of the animals died in the meantime or were excluded from the study, leaving 13. And this, though, was accepted by Food Standards Australia and New Zealand as evidence that this stuff is safe to eat. But clearly it was done with the idea that chicken growers would be satisfied that if they fed their animals genetically manipulated soy or corn, that they would reach market weight just as quickly without mostly dying as they would if they were fed conventional feed. And this is supposed to reassure us of the safety of these things. It's an ad hoc system. It doesn't set benchmarks and standards for the duration, the quality of research done. And yet somebody like the French scientific group, Seralini at the Caen University, has been all over the media being criticised for using 140 animals over a 2-year period and finding that the animals, the rats, were seriously damaged. To their credit, the Europeans are now going to do a replication of the study, and they're starting to move in the direction of saying, well, maybe 90 days with 10 animals is not sufficient, and we should be thinking about bigger studies and over a longer period, and particularly intergenerational studies of these crops and foods as well. So this goes completely in the opposite direction from what the Europeans are going in. Labelling consistent with US labelling. There's no labelling in the USA, and you may have heard that many states are now trying to introduce labelling on genetically manipulated foods, and of course the industry put $47 million into defeating the California initiative. It's currently engaged in defeating I-522, which is in the state of Washington, which is going for labelling as well, and a couple of states in the northeast have adopted labelling, but their laws say we need 5 states to agree to labelling within a certain time frame to create a critical mass of demand so that labelling would be viable. And meanwhile, the public's being told, you label, your bill's going to go up $400 a year for a family of 4 at least, etc. You know, the TV ads, the whole stuff. The Biosafety Protocol is criticised. The Convention on Biological Diversity, the first protocol under the treaty, is on the international transfer, handling and use, and there are 162 members, not including Australia and the USA, and yet it's being criticised and not observed. The majority of countries in the world are still GM-free, over 160 countries and another 60 dependent territories. Only 28 countries have actually adopted GM crops, and it's about time we considered the majority in this. So they're also into allowing contamination. So DFAT's told us that this is not part of the negotiation. However, on the 18th of April this year, 6 countries agreed on a joint statement on innovative agricultural production. It was secret. It was announced without any preamble, no public discussion or anything. They've said that it's non-binding, does not restrict in any way the ability to endorse countries to implement regulations as per World Trade Organization's rights and obligations. So it's still clearly very subject to trade considerations, and we could go through it. But basically, this statement is a variation on the biotechnology industry organisation's pitch to the TPP. So in a sense, we've got it already. Okay, it's not enforceable, and I can see Abbott's mob thinking, well, maybe it's a good idea. The Labor government already likes it, has already agreed to this, and so why don't we just put it back into the TPP negotiations? So bio gets its way without the TPP at the moment. I think that's what it really amounts to. The grain trading nations have agreed, and we may still see it recommitted to the talks, and we should be vigilant, and we're certainly doing what was suggested in the way of lobbying governments and so on to try to make sure that things like our state GM moratoria in Tasmania and South Australia can remain in place and not be knocked over, and that we can actually get some serious labelling of genetically manipulated foods in Australia, because despite the repeated claims of government that we have labelling, most things are exempt. Of the 55 varieties of soybean, corn, canola, cotton, sugar beet, potatoes and rice currently approved, only one would provisionally be labelled. All the others are exempt because they're vegetable oil, starches or sugars, or for some other made-up reason. So, food, I think Nick's given us the reasons to care about food, and innovation in food, particularly food irradiation, genetic manipulation, and now the introduction of nanotechnology into food production as well, is a serious public health concern for now and for the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Bob. You now have a very patient Francis Morrell from MADGE.
Yep.
Oh, that just goes to the report.
Oh, okay. Okay, what does this mean for us? What does its TPP mean? You can't hear me?
That one won't leave the room, just goes recording, so you just have to speak up.
Okay, sorry. So really what it wants to do, we've heard quite a lot already, so I'll try and whiz through quickly. It wants to open up barriers, especially in Japan, expand IP rights, extend the patent term, limit state-owned enterprises and limit national sovereignty. GM seeds are now patented, and there's a whole lot of restrictions around who can buy and sell and grow what seeds in previous trade agreements. That is causing problems. So as we've heard before, food labelling around GM country of origin, bans that we might want to put in to protect people, putting consumers and farmers' interests above investors, will be limited, and also, as we've heard, limiting government ability to change our food system. The head agricultural negotiator of the TPP on the behalf of the US is Islam Sadiq, and he's a former Monsanto lobbyist and former vice president of CropLife America, which basically is the head body of selling pesticides. And you can see really this agreement is about big industrial food that is wrecking the planet and causing enormous amounts of health problems straight in there. Why we had the march against Monsanto and why Monsanto is such a big player is you can see that the seed industry since the 1990s has been taken over by the chemical industry, which also sells pharmaceuticals. So you own the seed, the agricultural chemicals and the pharmaceuticals, and Monsanto's the biggest owner of seed in the world. Okay, I'll just quickly go through what effect it will have on the individual countries. So in August this year, thousands of people protested against what they called Monsanto's law, which is there is restrictions on traditional seed and heirloom seed going on all over the world, and it's incredibly dangerous for food security and genetic diversity. So we need as many crop plants as we can, food crop plants, and we need as much diversity within those crop plants as possible, especially as we're going into extreme climate change. Otherwise, we'll not survive. A few patented seeds owned by a handful of companies is going to wreck everything. So Peru passed a 10-year ban on growing GM crops to protect biodiversity, and Mexico has recently banned the growing of GM to try and protect its corn. Vietnam, Monsanto is testing its GM crops in Vietnam, and illegal papaya has been smuggled in from Thailand. So it looks like Vietnam is ready to be opened up to GM crops. So Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, Japan, they don't grow any, they import food, and there's very weak labelling. New Zealand grows no GM crops, and we grow cotton and a bit of canola. And as Bob said, there's no labelling, and the majority in North America and the majority of GM crops are grown in the US, and there's a list of them. Okay, we're eating soy, corn, sugar beet, canola, cotton. Alfalfa's an animal feed, but it's been approved for us to eat as well. And we don't eat GM papaya and squash because it's not approved. So these crops end up, they're not going to feed the world. They end up in processed foods, they're fed to animals, and they're turned into biofuels. Okay, what is GM? I'll just quickly say the two main traits are, one, you get a crop and you spray it with a chemical like Roundup, and the idea is the weeds die and the crop survives. This is wonderful for Monsanto because they own Roundup, so they can sell their patented herbicide to go with their patented seed. Okay, and the other trait is insect resistance, where the plant itself creates a toxin to kill certain insects. And there are some new crops that work by silencing genes. So Monsanto owns about 90% of the GM crops, and as I said, it produces the weed killer that you can spray on it. So it's a great package for them. And because what's happening, of course, is the weeds are becoming resistant to Roundup, so now you're going to have 2,4-D sprayed on your crops, and Fazance has recently approved a GM soy that can be sprayed with 2,4-D Roundup and glufosinate ammonia, which has been banned in Europe. Okay. So the main concerns about GM crops, I just really want to say, why have people been getting so upset about them? They haven't been properly tested to show that they're safe. They're patented, so it means that you can't do independent testing. You have to have the approval of the company. There's recent studies showing that there's harm from them to animals. There's reports of damage to crop and soil health, etc., etc. I'll go through and show you what's going on. The way GM foods have been approved is they've been assumed to be substantially equivalent to non-GM crops. That is an assumption that has not been proved by scientific testing. It's just like, oh, they're similar, so we don't need to test. And the FDA, basically writes a letter to the companies, say, your crop's fine, otherwise you would tell us, and we have to do testing on it. So that is the limit of the testing in the US, and Bob talked about Fazance's rigorous science. And what's happening is the science is beginning to say, actually, the animal feeding studies are showing harm, but what you will have probably heard in the mainstream media is, oh no, they're not, they're rubbish studies. In fact, they're not. So there's an enormous amount of problems that are coming up. And as I said before, the real problem with these GM crops is they're patented, and so it's really hard for independent scientists to do it. This is an Australian researcher showed that pigs fed GM corn and soy had stomach inflammation, and of course our Fazants just brushed that off, even though it was a peer-reviewed study. And again, this is the famous rat study that showed rats fed GM corn and Roundup for 2 years had incredible amount of tumours and had damage to their liver and kidney as well. And once again, it's just being thrown, these problems are just being ignored, really, and I won't go into how it was approved, but it's very minimal. And the other thing is as well that Roundup is being shown not to be this sort of minor, non-toxic, so safe you can drink it sort of chemical. It has major endocrine disruption functions, and it's been linked with birth defects. And there's an enormous amount of work coming out on that if you want to, you can go and look it up. But what's really worrying is the Roundup is being used in such enormous levels that it is being found in people's urine, and they have nothing to do with agriculture or using this chemical. And it's at levels that would not be allowed in drinking water. And it seems to be a sort of systemic problem that is also damaging crops and soil. So when you have GM crops and Roundup and this very high chemical agriculture, it's not just about what's it doing to me, but it's actually destroying the very soil and water on which our food depends. So pushing it in the TPP is incredibly dangerous. We've got super pests, super weeds, because when you spray things with chemicals, they come back even more strongly. And at the moment in Argentina, what's been happening is people are being swept off their farms so that the big soy producers come in, grow GM soy, and they export it, and enormous amounts of chemicals are used in this, and there is an epidemic of birth defects and cancer. The cancer rates are 41 times higher than normal, and the birth defects are about 4 times higher. Recently, 30 groups got together from Latin America and wrote open letters to the UN saying this is a legalised structural abuse of human rights that is close to a genocide. So, and you don't hear about this, you just hear about how it's going to feed the world. You don't hear about it's chopping down the Amazon, it's displacing people, and it's basically causing a near genocide. Nothing is labelled. I won't go through why. But what's interesting in the US is that we're beginning to get people who know nothing about GM, have a medical problem in their family, search the net, find out about this GM food, remove it from their diet, and have their family recover from a whole host of illnesses, including autoimmune diseases, a whole lot of digestive diseases. A baby's larynx was paralysed shut for up to 16 hours a day. So this whole range of people are suddenly saying, actually, we removed GM and we're a lot better. Of course, they're all being ridiculed, but you can get on the net and see their stories and decide for yourself. And really, I think the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement is a reaction to what Nick was talking about, which is people are beginning to say, we don't want this industrial food anymore. We don't want food from nowhere. We want food from somewhere that we know how it's grown and the conditions in which it was raised. And there has been an incredible increase in all of this stuff. And what is quite interesting to note in the US is how these innovative, creative local economies are being stamped out, like the little girl, 4-year-old, who was told by the USDA that she couldn't grow a garden for her disabled mother, so they couldn't grow a food garden. You've probably heard about people not being able to, they've turned their lawns into a productive food garden. They're told that they can't do it, and people providing raw milk are being sued. So this is an incredible trying to wipe out life, really, or have it controlled by corporations. And that's also, there's in the EU, they're trying to put through a new seed law that basically means you have to have authorised seed, which means you might be growing your heritage tomato, but if it's not on the authorised seed list, then you can't grow it anymore. So I think we need to be incredibly clear that this is about taking over life and giving us no options, and it is a corporate mindset that is all about concentration and power and extracting profit. That is not the way plants work. That is not the way life works. Plants work about you grow, you produce a huge amount of seeds, you share the abundance. and you have diversity, and that gives resilience. This is all about corporate stuff. You narrow it down, you control it. It is an incredibly dangerous position to put ourselves in, especially as we have these huge climate disruptions. So what we all have to do is say we want agroecology, La Via Campesina, People's Food Plan. It's all there, it all works. We can solve all our problems. We just have to get rid of corporations and get rid of the TPP. And I think, that's what we have to do, because what are corporations? They are zombies walking around that do not die. And I think it's time we put them out of our misery, or us out of their misery, whatever. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you for that whirlwind informative tour, both of you, Bob and Francis. Now, and thank you to the patient audience for sitting here as well through all this information. It's a lot to absorb. There is some time for questions if you're happy to stay and ask a few, or if you want to leave, you can. But if you want to stay and ask questions, I'm sure the panel won't mind. Is that okay? Yeah, sure.
The other panelists?
Yeah, the other panellists. You're okay? Yeah, all right. Nick was right. It is an unusual event in that you get both sort of civil society representatives and academics. It's an unusual combination, and you can probably see the different mindsets and focuses that come through. So I think I've been lucky to participate in it, and I hope you feel the same way. So any questions at all? I'll come around with the mic. Yeah, we'll start at the front. Yeah.
Thank you. I've got two questions, if that's okay. Just wondering, you were talking about the fact that China's excluded. What's the relationship between a bilateral agreement, such as if Australia made an agreement with China? How does that fit with the TPP?
Look, I'm not a legal person. I can't fully answer that. But what my understanding right now is that the TPP was set up very much to exclude China. And I was surprised to see that you mentioned that they're talking about, Matt, that they would come into it, because they haven't been asked. And from my understanding, if China signed the TPP, it would break their system completely. So I can't see this happening for China. But from looking at it, it looks like China's ability to withstand American interests may not be there, and they may sign it. But my understanding at this point is, I've just noted the big increase of bases in the Philippines, bases in Brunei, bases in Singapore. They're putting drone bases around China. It looks to me like they're ready to enact militarily to control China. So I can't answer legally.
What I'm trying to understand is if Australia made a separate agreement with China, a bilateral agreement, what's the relationship between that and the TPP? Is there one?
Sorry, do you want to say something?
Anybody here legal?
Yeah, happy to.
I'll pass you this.
I think that's one of the things that's being negotiated. The relationship between the TPP and your existing trade obligations is a crucial part of what they've had to think through. To give you an example, something I'm close to, the treatment of New Zealand programs as Australian under Australian TV content requirements. One of the things that the United States might argue is, why don't you effectively multilateralise that obligation under the TPP? So for the parties sitting around the table now, if you, Australia, were prepared to do that to New Zealand, this is your new family, it's got some more members in it, so treat all of our programs as Australian as well. So treat programs from the United States, from Japan, from Mexico, from Canada, treat them as Australian as well for the purpose of you've got. Obviously there'd be immense resistance to that. So that's really the argument. How does it fit? What we understand happens is that your existing obligations continue, and that you can effectively, so for an organisation from, how would I say it? We don't go back from that. So if we sign up to an agreement with the United States, which which doesn't treat everyone's programs as Australian for the purpose of Australian content requirements, it doesn't mean that New Zealand doesn't continue to get the benefit of the agreement it's already got. Does that make sense? And in the same way, if we've managed to negotiate access to the United States market in a particular way, favourable way to us under AusFTA, if we end up doing a deal in the TPP which provides a lower level of access, we won't go backwards on access to the American market. We'll stay where we are under the bilateral agreement we've already got.
Thank you. Another question at the back. Yeah.
No, I just have a very simple question. For the life of me, I cannot understand the benefit of an ISDS to any government in any country. Where is the two-way street on this concept? I can only see litigations being opened up and exposure to governments increased extremely, tenfold. So I don't see where the benefit is for us in this.
I won't speak for the government, but Tony Abbott, when he became Prime Minister, his first words were, "Australia is now open for business." And I think trying to put myself in their perspective, the justification they would say is, we need foreign investment. In agriculture, they say to modernise, to build the big, huge farms that we need to feed us, and to have, as they call it, have the dining boom replace the mining boom. We need capital investment. We don't have the capital domestically. We need the foreign capital to come in. That they are setting certain conditions, and this is a way of making ourselves attractive to foreign investment. That's my take on what the justification would be.
We've just come off the farm about 6 months ago, and at the moment I work for a Chinese consortium that's buying up quite decently within our own country as we sit here. But the farming sector for my wife and I was just beyond a joke. Tracts of land have been bought up for years, not since Tony Abbott's been in, not that I like the man, but Australian tracts of land has been bought up for at least the last 7 to 8 years.
Sure.
In fact, I think you said 15 yourself.
That's right. That's something that's gone under the radar because the conditions of the Foreign Investment Review Board was set at 250 million to trigger that process of review. So I don't think, and this is one of the questions, nobody really knows how much land in Australia, how much farmland is actually owned by, it wouldn't just be China. I think there's talk of Canadian pension funds, being interested in Australian farmland.
1%, but that's
Sorry?
They say less than 1% currently.
Right. Well, it'd be interesting to know the actual data on that and see some transparency because there's been some pretty big acquisitions recently.
There's someone over the other side, or a couple. All right. I'll start at the front and move back.
They can probably fudge it by comparing it with all the land mass rather than the arable land or something.
Yeah, I just had two questions. Whether the raw geopolitical situation would be affected if the US government defaulted in the next few days, if there was no agreement, whether that would have an impact on TPPs.
Having trouble hearing, sorry.
Sorry, the question was whether in the event of a US government default would affect the likelihood of an outcome with TPP. The second question related to the PBS. What's the likelihood of any of those three potential risks being placed into this or on the table, threatening the viability of that scheme?
So the first question was, how might the US default affect the TPP negotiations? Is that right? Yeah. Does someone want to address that one first?
I think that's really hard to answer. I think the government shutdown it was quite embarrassing to the American government in terms of Obama wasn't able to go to the APEC meeting and the TPP leaders meeting in Indonesia, and that's where we were expecting to hear some announcements about the TPP, and actually the TPP leaders announcement didn't announce really anything coming out of that meeting. So I think that the shutdown has probably stalled things for the US. Do you want
to add something about the shutdown. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's a big piece of elaborate theatre. I'm being quite cynical, but I think you see the deal being negotiated now is about pushing through an austerity agenda in the United States and having, clawbacks of this this healthcare reform and cuts to the welfare system over there and other measures and reducing government expenditure that's actually of public services and benefits to people. I really think the shutdown the default isn't going to happen. But I think the point's been made here, and I think the TPP has a wider geopolitical context, and it is about the US and China kind of facing off militarily and around trade, and China does hold the majority of the US government debt, so there would be certain implications there potentially.
In terms of the second part of your question about the PBS, I covered 3 areas. One was the intellectual property chapter. All of the other countries rejected the US proposals that were made in 2011 for intellectual property and pharmaceuticals. And a handful of countries have actually put a counter proposal on the table that is much more moderate than the US proposal. This Australian government was involved in developing a principles paper that proposal is based on, but wasn't actually involved in supporting the legal text itself because of the caretaker period just before the election. So it's unclear whether the Australian government will now support that counter proposal to the US proposal or not. And that's one of the things we're focusing on in our advocacy, asking the Australian government to support that counter proposal.
Is there any reference to where the counter proposal could be available online?
The counter proposal, like all of the other legal text in the agreement, is secret. So we only know little bits of information about it that have been leaked.
I'll also address the first part of that just with one statement. If the U.S. does have the debt ceiling default, it actually could just start a whole nother global financial crisis off. So that would affect where it goes forward, because our entire financial system would fall apart again. We didn't fix it last time, and there doesn't seem to be a political will to fix it.
I could anticipate that US hegemony could be significantly adversely affected.
That might be a good thing.
And that's why I asked the question. Yeah, thank you.
All right, we'll move up to the back.
Thanks for tonight, firstly. Secondly, the founder of Microsoft, Bill Gates, only shares Monsanto now. And and no doubt he will eat organic, like the boss of Monsanto. If the boss of Monsanto if GM food is not good enough for the boss of Monsanto, it's not good enough for us.
You're right that what Bill Gates has done is he's teamed up with the Rockefeller Foundation to create this organisation called A Green Revolution for Africa that has a lovely little website that's all about let's be sweet to women farmers in Africa. But really, the agenda behind it is to push in GM crops, and he did buy a huge amount of Monsanto shares, and so this did raise a huge amount of cynicism. And Africa has been incredibly important in pushing back against all these seed laws, because Africa, contrary to perceptions, is not a poor place. It is stuffed full of the massive riches that the corporations want, which is basically biodiversity. And there's a really good report by the ETC group, which is called the New Biomasters, as in biomass, because it shows how all the big companies like Chevron, Exxon, Monsanto, Goldman Sachs are eyeing up going into South America and Africa and using all that green stuff that we know as important biodiversity and turning it into plastics or oils or whatever. So, that's the aim. And unfortunately, it appears that this seed, the Common Market of Africa has recently signed this seed deal that civil society is up in arms against, because it's basically will authorise various seeds and criminalise a whole lot of other seeds. So basically, farmers in Africa absolutely depend on their own saved and shared and developed seed, and this is an agreement that will push all this industrial seed in. And I think that we need to really understand that the seed industry is only very, very recent. Interestingly, Europe didn't really have much of a seed development. England and France were seed breeders, but the seed breeding that was done was mainly done for the colonies. And in America, congressmen used to send out free seeds to their constituents, and the idea was that they would go west and take the seeds and breed them up. So America, until very recently, has had a huge history of seed development and seed sharing. And hybrids initially got rid of that, and then and way back when, it is always the seed companies that are pushing to restrict farmer rights around seed, which is exactly the opposite from what we need at the moment.
All right, so we'll come back. Is there anyone who hasn't asked a question yet who would like to? All right, okay. So did you have a question up here? Yeah.
My question's about how much cleverer we can be about organising opposition, because I personally am very pessimistic about this. I think there are very strong incentives in the US, within the Office of the US Trade Representative and that iniquitous 1980s Trade Act that they have. And that's very, very closely linked with a small number of corporates. It's linked with the farmers, it's linked with the Hollywood industries, it's linked with software, and it's linked with agribusiness. And they will make sure they get the TPPA because they've bloody written it. And it's got a whole lot of stuff for there. And as somebody cleverly pointed out, most of global trade is within companies. So they know exactly what the trade flows are. They're from them to them, right? Preferably deducting a whole pile of costs for charging themselves for their patents and copyright and trademarks. And in Australia, I mean, look, we signed the Fool's Trade Agreement with North America. We signed that American trade agreement against all the evidence. It was I'm from Canberra. It was very well known within Canberra that everybody, including the then Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, thought it was a bad deal for America. But Howard reckoned he had his face on the line and he managed to do it. And read the last chapter on how to kill a country if you want to understand that. They will sign it because even though things like this, don't let the foreign corporations sue Australia, are clearly not in our interest at all, they are in the interest of certain companies who pay money into the coffers of both our political parties. So the very ill-advisedly named Medicines Australia is very close to the federal government, and it mostly consists of people like Pfizer and AstraZeneca and Lundbeck and people like that who would love to be able to sue us whenever we change our health laws or health regulations. And this new website, which I've never seen before, which has the ambitious goal of 10,000, that's not enough. 10,000 signatures won't do it. We need at least 1 million people actively jumping up and down and saying to this government, do not sign this away. Do not tie the hands of all future governments across this wide range of domestic policy in exchange for selling a little bit more dried milk to Peru. Right. So we've got to get cleverer. We've got to get into media. And I don't know what the clever answers are, which is why I'm kind of putting it on the table and saying, we've got to find partners, we've got to find alliances, we've got to actually leverage it, because the US has put the screws on and said by the end of 2013. And that is a deliberate technique that the US and the EU use to have exhaustion among smaller parties who can't get there and can't resist. And I don't see Tony Abbott resisting.
Thank you.
Can I answer that? Or unless anyone else wants to go.
I'll say something, but you go.
No, you go
No,
first.
you go.
Well, I think, having looked at this and tried to work through rationally, talking to people, we've got a broken system, and it's the caterpillar and the butterfly. And, you know, this is what many people around here are trying to do, is raise knowledge about this. It's impossible to do that when the mainstream media refuse to report anything apart from how wonderful GM is and how it's going to feed the world. They report nothing about the near genocide. So how do we actually get across that? And bits of me thinks, well, we can only do so much. We can only do a holding pattern for so long. And in some ways, you know, we've stopped the rollout of GM crops all over Australia very rapidly. You know, we are doing something, but maybe it has to go ahead and everyone has to find out, like the farmers in, I can't remember, Colombia, they went on strike for 3 weeks because under the free trade agreement they cannot live. And I think, well, we either inform everyone and we get action together, or maybe it all has to, people have to see the reality of it and then understand, you know, we all need to take action, but eventually we'll all have to create a new world.
All right, thank you. Did you want to say one last word, Nick?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I agree that the prospects are that this will go through. You know, it seems very likely. One thing I didn't mention is that free trade is having a major impact already in agriculture. In this state, hundreds of thousands of fruit trees are being uprooted because there's no market for the produce. I think what we're trying to do is, despite these big processes at the global level, is go forward where we can. We're seeing a lot of movement, a lot of positive movement in Australia at the local government level. One of the things that we're pushing with the People's Food Plan is urban agriculture. A project I'm about to work on is an urban agriculture charter for Victoria and a network for the state to promote diverse forms of food growing in our cities and our towns around the state. So that's something that we can do, where we've got an open door with governments and a broad coalition of industry sectors, and our kind of perspective is that these things will go through and we'll see the consequences, but in the meantime we can be working constructively and positively to get change happening on the ground and hopefully build a bit of a grassroots movement and raise awareness. But you're right, at this point it's pessimistic, the outlook.
Can I just add something?
I think we'd better wrap it up. I think it's getting quite late.
Can I just put in a quick plug for AFTINET? AFTINET, the Australian Fair Trade and Investment Network, it's a peak organisation that's focusing on the whole range of issues related to the TPP and public interest, and they're very under-resourced. They need people and they need, they need contributions. So do have a look at what AFTINET's doing and consider becoming a member or supporting them financially.
.org, Deborah? Is it
aftinet.org.au.
All right. Well, thank you, panel members. It did go well over time. So thank you all for your patience, and thank you, audience, for your patience too. Yeah.
This has been a Swinburne production.